Thank you. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. And it was not a nasty, wet hole with an oozy smell and the ends of worms and all kinds of nasty little things, nor was it a sandy hole with no place to sit and nothing to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. Another story. Jill enters Narnia, and she is thirsty after her journey, and she comes upon a river. And at the river, she sees a giant lion. And she realizes that she doesn't like this at this point, but then she hears the lion speak. And the lion says, "If you are thirsty, come and drink." And she's a bit shocked. She's not sure who has said this. And then she hears the lion say it again. "If you are thirsty, come and drink." And she takes one step forward. And then she says, would you please go somewhere else? And the lion responds by a look and a growl in his throat. And she realizes that she might as well have asked the entire mountain to move for her own convenience. She then asks, "Do you promise not to do anything to me?" And the lion says, "I make no promises." And then she asks, after taking one small step forward, "Do you eat little girls?" And the lion responds, "Young lady, I have swallowed boys and girls, men and women, kings and queens, and empires." And she responds, "Well, I daren't come and drink." And the lion says, "Then you will die of thirst." And she says, "Well, then I shall go and look for another stream." And the lion responds, "There is no other stream." And then finally, at the end of this interaction, she kneels down and she drinks. And what Lewis tells us is that it is the most refreshing drink she has ever had. The coldest, coolest water. And he says, you only need a little bit, and your thirst is quenched. Now, if you're here for any number of reasons, perhaps you like the books, perhaps you don't understand the books, perhaps you've never read the books, but this piqued your interest, I always say that there is just simply something about the Inklings. Something about, in particular, these two men, Lewis and Tolkien, that keeps bringing generations of folks back. And the question that sort of starts us off is why? What is it about them that draws us into their works? Why do just those two paragraphs that I sort of paraphrased for us, why do they elicit and evoke something in us of wonder? In two very different ways, even. In Tolkien's world, it is the wonder of something foreign, something we're not used to, something not quite allegorical. Bilbo isn't Jesus, but there's something going on in that story that at least captures a theological element. And of course, the Narnia series have a more closely one-to-one relationship to the stories of the scriptures and the stories that Lewis tells. There's just something about them. Both books, even before the success of the movies on either side, were international bestsellers for generations. In fact, there is one argument to say that Tolkien in particular is the author of the century of the 20th century. Now there's a lot of snobbishness out there, and a lot of the literary critics will not place him as such. But his books continue to sell. They sold very well from the beginning, and they only escalated. And there was just simply something that was drawing people in. Tolkien, the fellow there on the right, in fact, in some ways, started an entire new genre of literature simply by himself. And it is a genre we today generally call fantasy literature. Usually something a little bit more gothic, usually something with swords, sometimes with kings, and all kinds of different creatures that we don't meet in everyday life, but which color a portion of a land that is not our own, yet somehow feels very familiar. Lewis, of course, is the favorite of all evangelical Christians, at least to some extent. Not that evangelicals like everything he has to say about every single thing, but there's simply something about him that continues to draw us into both his fictional writing and his nonfiction apologetics works. Well, what it is about them, frankly, is we really don't know. Now, the Inklings were a group of Oxford scholars, and some on the peripheries of Oxford in England, who got together just simply as friends. Really, it was a glorified book club. Only in this case, the Inklings wrote their own books. Now, they read other works, but from time to time, they would bring in little chunks, little pieces, little chapters of the things that they were writing. And they would encourage one another. And they would say, that is very good, or no, I don't like that. You might want to do this. You might want to think about this. Tolkien very famously brought one of the early renditions of the first chapters of The Lord of the Rings as he was writing them, and one of his colleagues began to laugh, not Lewis, but one of his other colleagues began to laugh and said, uh-oh, here we go, hobbits and elves again. And he sort of snarked, and Tolkien sheepishly put the manuscript away and waited later to talk to Lewis alone about it. There's just simply something there. Now, that on its own is enough to get us here tonight to talk about it, but why are we doing an entire course on this? What is it there that we could really wrestle with? And the short answer is that when we engage the writings of someone from the past, we're always confronted with a challenge. It's true if you read scripture, it's true if you read fiction, it's true if you read nonfiction, it could be any literature that you want. When you read something from the past, you're always being asked to interpret. You're always being asked to think. And you're always being asked to think not just about the text, but about the man or the woman who has written the text. What was their world? What was making them tick? What was their personality? What were their phobias? What were their fears? All these things get wrapped up in the way we come to the text, the way we read it. And so what this course is really a case study for us in the class. It is an opportunity, frankly, to read books we, at least most of us, already like or have already read, but to perhaps be woken up to the fact that we were asleep when we were reading them. Because I'm going to tell you tonight that in two of the most famous series of books, the Hobbit itself and what we call the Narniad, which means this the series of books that relate to Narnia, have been read perhaps wrongly. Now, I'm not here with some new mystical insight. I'm not here to give you something brand new that isn't already out there in the literature of all the secondary sources. But I find it always a bit sort of startling whenever, say, I come to talk to someone about the Hobbit, come to talk to someone about the Narniad, that I always get at least one response, and I'm sure it's lurking in this room somewhere, which is, well, that's just kids' literature. That's just children's literature. Now, the important part of that sentence is the word just. Just children's literature. As if the book was some sort of fantasy, some kind of imagination, some kind of escapism that we're supposed to read to escape the cares of everyday life and then put down and go, with a sigh and go back to the everyday things that are around us. Lewis actually had a good response for this. He says, unfortunately, the only people who don't like escape are jailers. So escapism isn't necessarily always the worst thing in the world. Nevertheless, what I'm about to say tonight is that if you've been approaching these books in that way, if you think that this is just children's literature, that there's not something going on, that a group of Oxford professors wouldn't think of something a little bit more deep than, I know a good story, let's do this. Let's have little short people with hairy feet. That will make them really buy my books. That if that's all you have when you come to it, then there's actually some deeper level of engagement that perhaps is missing. Now, let me start by saying that Lewis and Tolkien, if they were here tonight, and if you were to tell them, well, all I read it for is the enjoyment of the story, would actually respond, good. That is fine. You don't have to be a savant. You don't have to be a literary critic. You certainly don't have to be an Oxford professor to understand the books, which is why they wrote children's literature. But what they always said is that if a good story is good, it always invites the person back into it, multiple readings, and it always wakes up in the person's mind something deeper than just the story itself. And so tonight, that's what I want to take you through, the elements of this story that are a bit deeper, so that in the end, if you reread or at some later date reread again these stories, they might evoke something in you that might not have been there before. Now, pop quiz. Which of the two men on the screen wrote an allegory? Come on. Lewis. Anyone else? Did Tolkien ever write allegorically? He said no, someone says. Good. The answer is neither do, and yet both do. What do I mean? Allegory is one of the most misunderstood things, I think, in the engagement with these books and with other books. And that is because I think in our modern vocabulary, the word allegory has kind of become mushy. Very often what we mean by allegory is it represents something else. So if I talk about Pilgrim's Progress, that's a very clear allegory. So much so that the characters are actually named for the thing that they're representing. So you have patience sort of speaking as has legs and it walks and it talks, these kinds of things. Very clearly allegorical. Does Paul, the Apostle Paul, does he use allegory? Yes. When he refers to the church as the body of Christ, he is speaking, as we say in English literature, in an allegorical fashion. He's not saying that Jesus' body is physically us, that we are somehow skin cells and liver cells and stem cells and all these kinds of things. What he's saying is there is an analogy. When you look at a body and you look at the church, there is an analogy there. There is something that is represented by the image of a body. And both of these authors, Lewis and Tolkien, are very open to the concept of being allegorical, and they both hate the word allegory. And we actually know this from their letters. The first thing to sort of disabuse you of, the comment, the very common comment, actually, that Tolkien did not write allegory, is actually against his own phraseology about his own works. And yet it is also true because in most of the prefaces of The Lord of the Rings, there is this old preface that Tolkien wrote late in life in which he goes, no, it's not an allegory, it's not an allegory, it's not an allegory. So why in the world would I say it has allegory? Well, it all depends on what you interpret Tolkien as meaning. When Tolkien says the word allegory, he means the Pilgrim's Progress model. As if Tolkien is saying, it's not as if I sat down and said, let me think of a good idea for how to communicate the gospel. He actually says in his personal letters to the publisher, as he was writing the books, he says, I sat down to write a good story. And then after rereading it, when I went back to edit the volumes and edit the books, I realized that there was so much rich drama that could be made to communicate biblical theological truths. And in fact, he repeatedly says that certain characters, certain moments, and certain things are allegorical. Now, that's a lot to stand up on the difference between allegory and allegorical. So perhaps we need new words. I don't have one for you, but needless to say, when Lewis and Tolkien are accused of being either allegorical or not, I think we are confusing them. Meaning, Tolkien very explicitly says, in fact, when you have a good story, when it's woven together in the best possible way, when the characters in it ring true, when the story rings true, when the virtue of the main character, whatever it might be, rings true, it is only natural to find some allegory in it to something else. And he specifically says, of course the ring is something like magic and power and the atom bomb and all of these things that are so awful in our world. But he says that's because everything the human touches becomes power and evil and something that we twist and pervert. We create the internet, then we jam it full of internet pornography. And so what Tolkien says, of course, when you come across a good story about a ring that corrupts, the corrupting part of us always says, yep, that's something I experience. Or when you come across on the other side of that coin, something that is virtuous, something noble, something self-sacrificial, if it's a good part of the story, Tolkien says, then it is, of course, referring to our Lord. So that being said, I'm going to say tonight that there is more going on in the Hobbit than you might think, a little bit more allegorical interpretation, and this is the biggest travesty, the Narnia series ain't just something Lewis thought would sound nice and just jam a Jesus line in there, and then we'll do a bunch of biblical interpretation. He actually specifically says the opposite. He says, I'm going to do something a little bit more layered, something a little bit more interesting, something a little bit more artistic, maybe? And so there's more going on there. Now, to start with, The Hobbit. The Hobbit is by far, for most people, the first engagement with some of this literature. Maybe it was Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Frankly, it all depends on what someone handed you first. I can be a little bit autobiographical here. The Hobbit is the first book I ever read. I grew up in a small town, about 10,000 people, had a mother who was chronically sick, very often would be sleeping 15, 16 hours a day. Grew up in a quiet house, you might say. And for me, there was no necessary noise that I could be making. That wasn't going to happen. And so I eventually, at a youngish age, late by some estimations, right about the time when I was beginning middle school, I went up to my grandmother's house in Birmingham, Alabama for surgery. I had jaw surgery. I had some issues. And there, in my convalescence, sucking on milkshakes because I couldn't chew anything, I found a copy of The Hobbit. And I picked it up and I thought, all right, this will do. And that began with me a bit of a quest. I was not a Christian at the time, did not become a Christian for some time, for some years. But in a way similar to C.S. Lewis himself, the wonder that this book kind of evoked in me, the sense of it ringing true, as Tolkien always says, just kept me going. Then I read The Lord of the Rings. I eventually found the Narniad and several others. And then I went even full bore into geekdom and started reading other fantasy books and all these kinds of things. But The Hobbit for me has always been the first book that set me, frankly, onto a life to the guy you see standing here, which is someone who likes books but likes fiction and likes finding how stories can evoke this in us. Well, The Hobbit is, again, by and large, the entree, I should say, into Tolkien's world. Now, a couple things need to be said about how he created it. The creation of The Hobbit is a very simple story. Now, in a later lecture, I'm going to give you more concrete stuff on Tolkien's biography, who he was, these kinds of things. But I can give you the history of The Hobbit as a book. Tolkien one day, as he was grading papers, sitting out on the porch, as he says, in the 1930s, found in one of these exam books. Now, students, there was a time when you were handed an exam book. They were usually little blue books. In the UK, they were a slightly different color, but you would be grading them, and what would happen is very often professors at this day and age, actually all the way down until today, didn't make much money, and so what you would have to do is, as a professor, is you would have to grade extra papers for a little auxiliary income. Well, one day, Tolkien was grading, I think something to the tune of 200 or 300 essays from late, what we in America call late high school age students, and Tolkien found, to his delight, an empty page. The student had stopped, didn't write anymore. Tolkien said he almost gave him extra credit for that, and he found the empty page, and on it he wrote in the 1930s, "In a hole there lived a hobbit." And Tolkien says he sat there and he wondered, well, what in the world is a hobbit? It had sprung seemingly from the corners of his mind, this word, this hobbit word. and he decided that he was going to begin crafting it. Now again, the story of how The Hobbit comes about is too often told that Tolkien wrote a lot of stories for his children. You might have heard of this tale. He wrote stories for his children, and then he goes, well, shucks, this is a pretty good story. I think I'll try and have it published, for the kids. Meanwhile, I'll go back to Anglo-Saxon and the other things that are more mature. But actually, Tolkien, from the very beginning, writes The Hobbit with his Oxford professors as his potential target audience. He doesn't actually have publication in mind. And so he writes, in a hole there lived a hobbit. He then set about to actually flesh out a story about it, what a hobbit was, what it might be like, and then he crafted this very interesting story, start to finish, that was a single volume. Finished it by 1932, and he handed it to his old pal, his old buddy, C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis, for Tolkien, really is the midwife for Tolkien's entire stories. Tolkien was a bit of a shy guy. He did not want to publish them, at least not in the fullest sense. He was not seeking his own sort of fame and fortune. But Lewis said, no, you need to publish this. And Tolkien had actually published some poems that eventually make their way into the Lord of the Rings. So he was already kind of about this world already. He was already crafting little bits here and there. He'd already begun to create the languages of Elvish. He actually crafted two languages that became different versions of different dialects of Elvish. What a geek. But at the end of the day, I'm just jealous. But at the end of the day, he was already crafting this world, but The Hobbit kind of stood on its own. It was just one chapter in it. And he handed it to C.S. Lewis, and Lewis, as a good cheerleader, as a good friend, began to pass it to others. And Lewis eventually passes it to one of his students named Elaine Griffiths. Griffiths. And Elaine was just an Oxford student, and she had a friend who was an acquisitions editor at a publishing house. That friend came to visit. She wasn't coming looking for anything. And Elaine Griffiths said, you have to read this manuscript. It's written by an Oxford professor. It has the same style and the same depth and the same wonder as Alice in Wonderland, which was the real big hit at this time. And of course, Alice in Wonderland had been written by an Oxford professor as well. And so the publishing house said, all right, we'll see it. Let's do it. We want to read it. And so it landed in the inbox of Unwin's publishing house. And the rest, as they say, is history. So it does not begin actually as children's literature. The thing that's often overlooked, though, is Tolkien's sources. While it might seem tempting that simply by the fact that Tolkien wrote the first sentence almost subconsciously, it would be wrong to assume then that what Tolkien then did is go on to just sort of make stuff up, sort of out of thin air. Sort of pure imagination. Actually, what we know about Tolkien from his letters, from his conversations with friends, is that this crazy story of a short person with hairy feet going off with a wizard and some dwarves to slay a dragon and to get the Arkenstone back actually has significant parallels, and in some cases, full-scale borrowings from ancient literature. You see, Tolkien was a scholar of what we call Anglo-Saxon literature. Now, in high school and college textbooks, Anglo-Saxon is often referred to as Old English. So Old English is Anglo-Saxon, and Anglo-Saxon is Old English. It's actually, if you were to pick up an Anglo-Saxon textbook, you wouldn't be able to read it. There's nothing English about it. It's Germanic-based. But Old English was what Tolkien spent all of his days and nights in. And one of the biggest books that he was actually an expert on, and actually wrote one of the most important books on this book, was the epic Beowulf. That crazy, wild fantasy book that many of us read when we're in high school, and the only thing we know is there's a monster, and Beowulf rips his arms off, and it's kind of cool. It's kind of like a wrestling match. And we never really think that much more about Beowulf. But this was Tolkien's world. And so as he's writing The Hobbit, he has a number of sources, and I list 4 of them here. There are some others. First and foremost, Tolkien uses some of the other literature that's being published in his own day. Now, I'm not going to go into some of that, because it's not actually full borrowings. Rather, there were some books being published around the time of The Hobbit that dealt with dragons, that dealt with adventures and these kinds of things. And we're pretty certain that Tolkien used this, borrowed this, and wanted to kind of evoke the same wonder that he had when he read these other books. The other three, though, are vital. And they are Anglo-Saxon and Gothic literature, which I'm going to go into in just a second, very briefly. I'm not going to bore you with crazy Gothic stuff, but I'm going to tell you some of the places where we know that Tolkien is trying to evoke some of the ancient world for his nation of England. Because as the nation of England began to sort of tussle with the world wars, what they began to sort of ask is, who are we? And Tolkien's answer is, don't forget that you were Anglo-Saxon at one time. There is this heritage there. And just as the Brothers Grimm down in Germany had given a codified book of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Rapunzel and all the Disney movies, frankly, what Tolkien wants to sort of raise up for his English readers is that we are Anglo-Saxon, that there's an Anglo-Saxon heritage that he wants to be proud of. And so he wants to weave some of these things into the story. More on that in just a second. Thirdly, though, and vitally, Tolkien is profoundly Christian in this book. Now that strikes some people as strange. You're like, well, where is Jesus? Who is he? Is it Gandalf? No, and I'll more on that later. He's not actually Jesus, but he's Christ-like. But so is Bilbo. So is Thorin Oakenshield at times, before he becomes kind of a loser at the end of the book. So are others. But his Christian faith is woven in, and I'm going to give you some of those pieces in just a minute. The last one is one I'm going to spend a little more time on, and that's Tolkien's allegorical imagination. More on that. Okay, first, just some Anglo-Saxon stuff. It might surprise you to know that Tolkien didn't invent the word Hobbit. It had already existed. Now, Tolkien appears to have been unaware of this, but we actually have a book. It's called the Dentham Tracts. It is an ancient text that was republished right about the time of Tolkien, and in it, in the second volume, and on several of the pages, it lists all these magical creatures that were said to have existed in the time past. I guess they were now defunct. And this is just a snippet of it. It says that there are scarecrows. Apparently they thought these were real things, not just things from the Wizard of Oz. Scarecrows, will-o'-the-wisps, drakes, trolls, and then hobbits and hobgoblins. Now, what is going on in the word hobbit it's two stages. Hob is in the ancient languages, particularly Anglo-Saxon, it's the word of making things small. So a hobgoblin just means a shrunken down goblin, right? It's a tiny little goblin. And then there's this ending bit, hobbit. Now, some people have thought that the bit means rabbit. I have no idea why, but this has become one of the interpretations. It's crazy. But what seems to be the case is that a hobbit is something that had been lost. It was some name for some creature that was believed to be a magical creature centuries and centuries before Tolkien's time. It was since lost. And so what Tolkien does, we know, is he just invents what a hobbit would be. Now, how he thought he had invented the word and yet it had already existed, it takes some explaining. We don't really know. He didn't really know. It's probably the case that he came across it repeatedly in the original languages. It was sort of lodged back there, and he just wrote, "In a hole there lives a hobbit," and he goes, "Eureka, something new," and he goes with it. But the word existed, but Tolkien can say, we had no idea what it was. So the Hobbit really is Tolkien's invention, though the word existed before. That's one thing. Secondly, in the Elder Edda, it's a text of Viking Norse mythology. It's where we get lots of stories of Loki and Thor with his blonde hair and sexy abs. All these things. Actually, sorry, I have to say this. Thor, in traditional Norse mythology, is not a handsome guy. He's closer to Fred Flintstone than he is to the recent depictions of Thor. He's sort of barrel-chested and drinks a lot and gets angry and throws his hammer. But nonetheless, in this book, the Elder Edda, it was a text that had been lost for centuries. It was actually discovered in the early 1800s in somebody's farmhouse, sort of buried back behind some things. And it was a lost text. And it told all these mythologies of the Norse and the Viking and the Anglo-Saxon world, so naturally, Tolkien thought it was interesting. And in this story, there is listed a fragment of the following people that are on a quest. Fili, Owen, glowy, which you can just add an N on the end, glowin, biver, bobor, bomber, dory, nori, dwalin, don't miss the V, blaine, dane, thane, and then if you see that word there, looks like a P, it's this letter rather, that's actually what we call a thorn in Old Anglo-Saxon, and it's where in English we get the sound TH. So that letter just means TH. So if you put a TH when you see that letter, Thorin Eikenskaldi, which if you transliterate into English is Thorin Oakenshield. And then, last but not least, Gandalfer. There in the Elder Ada, centuries old, is a story of a quest of a group of people that have dwarvish names. The last is the only one with a patronymic, as we say, or a last name. So clearly the leader of the group. And then Tolkien, being a language guy, noticed that there was this name Gandalfer, which just literally means wizard elf. And there is no story associated with this list of names. All we have is a list of names and people and a knowledge that they're going on a quest. And again, Tolkien just lifts this up, twists a few of the names, translates one of the names. And at some point, as he's studying this list, he realizes that what in the world is an elf doing running around with a bunch of dwarves? You see, in the original, a wizard elf, tall guy, is running around with a bunch of short dwarves going on a quest. And out of that little kernel, Tolkien builds a whole world. And over time, Gandalf ceases to be an elf and he becomes something else. More on that later. And what he ends up doing then is taking this sort of echo of Anglo-Saxony, this echo of the Gothic world, of the Germanic world that had been long lost in the Dark Ages. And he writes an entire story out of it. There are other little fragments. I'm going to be quicker now. In the Gothic language, there's this phrase. It's Merkvith in Kuni rather. Pathless Mirkwood. And the word wasn't Mirkwood, it just meant a really nasty, gnarly forest that was very prevalent in the northern Germanic world. Tolkien pulls this out and he crafts it. Lastly, this guy, Bjorn. Now, in the recent movies, of course, he's a kind of crazy man with awesome sideburns, very angry, he turns into a bear, he yells, this kind of a thing. In the story, it's, of course, told differently, but the story of Bjorn is the story of a guy who changes shape. It says that he can become a bear at times, and other times he looks like a man. Interestingly enough, Bjorn in The Hobbit is Beowulf. And what happens if you actually go back and read the Beowulf story is you'll see, and this is what Tolkien has picked up on, Beowulf acts like a bear. When Beowulf is confronted with the monster Grendel, who sneaks into the mead hall and tries to steal people and eat them, kind of grim, what ends up happening, as you see here in this picture, this rendition of it, he literally rips the guy's arm off. And he yells and he grunts, and there's this sort of bear-like quality which these German people loved. All right. I haven't lost you yet with a bunch of Gothic Anglo-Saxon talk. What does all this mean? Where are the Christian elements? How is this an allegory? What are the allegorical elements? Well, simply put, the way The Hobbit reads is purely allegorical. The way it should be read if you actually take into account some of the things that I've just told you. The Beowulf story, the fact that these things are in the Elder Ada and several others. And that's only, by the way, the tip of the iceberg. Let me recount for you the beginning of The Hobbit. And if you haven't read it, sorry, spoiler alert. But let me recount some of the story here. What you see when you open up the first several pages of The Hobbit is, of course, you get a description of who the Hobbit is. But the next thing that happens is you have a short little hobbit, Bilbo, sitting on his step doing what? Someone goes his pipe, everyone goes there. What else is he doing? He's reading his mail. When is the post office invented? Quite late. It didn't happen in Anglo-Saxon times. Certainly not so much that he would smoke a pipe and sit out on the stoop. By the way, when was tobacco introduced into England and into Europe? 1500s. But much, much later did it become serious pipe smoking. In fact, it's actually Victorian, which is just prior to Tolkien's generation. So you have a hobbit smoking a pipe, reading his mail, reading his letters, sitting in front of this hobbit hole that has a door with a handle right in the center. And people think, that's brilliant. So, won't break off the end, put it in the middle. It's something kind of strange. Until you actually go to Oxford or Cambridge and realize that just about every stinking door in those cities has a handle right in the middle. So he's reading his mail, and as you read the first couple of chapters, there are other allusions. He refers to the whistle of a train at one point. And were trains invented? Sorry, I'm beating this to death. The last bit, the thing that I think drives it home. As this clearly very British, Victorian, Edwardian, British short guy is sitting on his stairs, this wizard walks up. This blast from the past, from literature. And if you read that exchange back and forth, what happens? Gandalf simply will not abide by what? The linguistic patterns, the speech patterns. We have this in the Deep South, where you'll say something nice and you mean something mean. And Bilbo does just this, doesn't he? A good day. What does Gandalf do? What do you mean by that? Do you mean it is a good day, or you want me to have a good day? Or do you mean that it's a good day whether or not I'm having it or not? And it kind of breaks all this down. And it flusters Bilbo, because he has clearly given a signal, go away. Good day, go away. And the wizard simply will not do it. And in fact, the wizard barges literally into his house at some point, plays a prank on him, scrawls this symbol on his door, which is a rune, which is, of course, Anglo-Saxon. And then suddenly, literally, in tumble these dwarves into this very Victorian, this very late turn-of-the-century house. Now, yes, there are mythical elements. There are fantasy elements in it. But we know that in the early 1900s, this was actually read as comedic. Some of you will know the name W.H. Auden. He was an American poet, very, very famous writer. He actually struck up something of a pen pal relationship with Tolkien, was a big fan of the works, these kinds of things. Where Auden actually wrote a review of The Hobbit that went in the New Yorker. And in it, he actually says right off the bat, of course, the early chapters are comedic. He says it is a play on now and the past. It is clearly something that is going on where Tolkien is trying to be funny. And of course, he says, and it's out, the jury's out as to whether or not he actually manages to be funny at this point. But Auden says this is clearly modern man confronted with the past, being sort of bombarded with the past. And then there's one other phrase that I think really elicits exactly what Tolkien is trying to say, which is when the dwarves come in and when Gandalf comes in and they start talking about this quest, at one point they do what? They sing. And of course, like most of us in the modern impatient world, we skip the songs, get me back to the paragraphs, enough with the rhyming. But if you get to the next section, there is a very clear comment that Tolkien makes where he says, when he hears the songs of the past, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, when he hears these songs, he is carried up, taken away, and run off over the mountains to this past, this almost evocation of an idea that he has forgotten about. So here you have this stuffy, very, very much Victorian man, who is a hobbit, of course, who is being carried off into this adventure. And in fact, that's the rest of the book. He is swept away. He complains half of the book, then he becomes into his own. He changes along the way. Something about being exposed to these Anglo-Saxon parallels makes Bilbo a better person. And then when he comes back, what? He's weird. All of the other hobbits that share the old patterns, the very stuffy patterns, the sit on the stoop and read your mail and smoke your pipe and don't worry about the outside world, all of those remaining hobbits find Bilbo strange, because he has now been immersed in a world that is not their own. So the book, The Hobbit, is actually allegorical, or it has allegorical pieces to it. And it's even more important, I think, when you realize, we actually go to Tolkien's letters, he says on multiple occasions, I am Bilbo. That despite the fact that I'm not short and I don't have hairy feet and I don't wear colored waistcoats, he says, I'm Bilbo. He says all of the descriptions of Bilbo as being stuffy, all the descriptions of Bilbo's diet, where he likes bread and butter on bread that is untoasted and these kinds of things, he goes, that's what I eat. He specifically says, that's me. And so what happens in The Hobbit is Tolkien weaves a story below the surface, of course. The story is there on its own, but below the surface, there is this deep sense that what Tolkien is saying is that our world has something wrong with it. And that is actually, Tolkien says later, a core conviction of all of his literature. The world has something wrong with it. That despite the good things that you experience, and there's a lot of good things in any of Tolkien's books, despite the good things, despite the meals, despite the laughter, despite the joy, despite the good virtues that you see, like bravery and patience and long-suffering, but despite all of these things, Tolkien repeatedly says, what is woven rather throughout all of my books is this sense that there's something not quite right. In other words, he wants people to experience through the story in that kind of aching sense this idea of the fall. This idea that we all experience in our day in and day out lives, where we can go on vacation, we can have, depending on your relationship with your family, you can have a good family dinner, you can have all kinds of joys, you can have friends, you can have children, you can have innumerable joys in this life. But woven throughout all of these things for all of us, and no one is the exception save Christ, woven throughout all of this is this deep sense of something not quite right. Not the worst thing in the world by far. We don't live in the pit of hell, we live in God's good creation. And Tolkien is very keen to show us experiencing that good creation, or show the hobbits experiencing that good creation. But he wants people to know there's something wrong. And the way you experience something wrong, he often says, is by experiencing the loss of what you cherish the most. In almost any one of Tolkien's books, there's always somebody in some chapter at some point who has something that is the most dear thing to them, that when they lose it, their world falls apart. Obviously, Gollum, the ring. What about Thorin Oakenshield? He has this kingdom, this power, this might, this money, this Arkenstone, whatever it might be, and he is driven mad by it. There's something wrong, Tolkien always says. Even in the good things, even in Frodo, even in Bilbo, in other characters, only a few ever in Tolkien's world do not have something that doesn't tear and gnaw and pull at their innermost being. This sense of longing. Even something as important as a good quest can go foul. Tolkien will always say, evil is not simply the worst possible thing you can ever experience. Evil is not pure evil. And in fact, he says repeatedly, the worst kind of evil, the most sinister kind of evil, happens when someone has a good goal in mind, a good desire in mind, something that they believe is virtuous or that they know is virtuous. And in their immodesty, in their arrogance to see this happen in their own day, it perverts them, it twists them. Even one of the Fellowship of the Ring desires the ring for good and eventually gets himself killed. In other words, it is not just the worst things of the world that corrupt us. As I used to drive up to Birmingham when I went to college, there was always this fateful sign as you drove up, right on the right, going up Highway 60. There was literally a devil with a red pitchfork and everything. And it said, go to church or the devil will get you. I went to church. No, I'm kidding. I was already going to church. But this sense of that the world is about to crush us and that we are pitted against always the worst kinds of evil, Tolkien wants to obliterate. He hates that model. Now, he admits there is ultimate evil. You have Sauron, you have Mordor, you have serious evil. but woven throughout all of his books is this sense, and it's very prevalent in The Hobbit, there's just something not quite right. Something gnawing at us. I always say, throughout the doctoral process that I went through and all these kinds of things, I had to study a bunch of languages, forgotten most of them, thankfully, at this point. But what I found very striking as I was reading different languages and trying to learn them and slogging through these grammars is that every single language that is written down, at least, and probably can be said for even the uncodified languages, every language, every style of language that I've looked at has it has a word in it, I should say, that actually isn't a noun and it isn't a verb, but rather it is a grunt. There was always written something in every language, and it's different each time, that expresses this impossibly gnawing sense that something's wrong. In English, it's usually the word O-H, or ugh. How do you write that word down if you're trying to write out a story? In German, it's something else. In Greek, it's something else. In Hebrew, it's something else. Why is it that every single human language has this grunt, this sort of gnawing sense of, it's good, but there's something wrong? And when we read Tolkien, when we read The Hobbit, it comes out, I think, pretty strongly. This sense that there is something wrong that is not pure evil, but it's within us. We, the image of God, have bought into the lie. And to the extent that the Holy Spirit is sanctifying us day by day, those little sighs, those little grunts, those little cries of pain, whether psychological, physical, whatever it might be, are always the cries of a heart that says, "Come quickly, Lord Jesus. Put everything aright. Make everything better. It's good now. We got Jesus, but we need more. There is still something there that is missing."